Welcome to the third day of the IUG. I hope you've been having fun so far. If you just arrived this morning, welcome to The Hague. My name is Eric Roovers. I am the VP of Business Transformation in the EMEA region for Software AG. And this morning, we're going to talk about the combination of ARIS and Alphabet. So I'll be presenting for a brief time on how we as Software AG position ARIS and Alphabet, and the respective disciplines that we support from those two products. And after my presentation, we'll have a presentation from the company Bruhati, one of our partners, who have a booth outside that I encourage you to visit. And they will be talking about how they are supporting the TM Forum framework through the combination of ARIS, Alphabet, and ARIS. And afterwards, Pieter Walraven will talk about how Friesland Campina are using Alphabet to essentially clean up their application portfolio through a capability management approach. Having said that, let's kick off with, as far as I'm concerned, some of the key concepts of why we have ARIS and Alphabet in our portfolio, why we support and how we support customers with it. And I'm going to take you a little bit on a trip of how we established those two products within our portfolio. So I'm going to talk about how we help our customers to transform, optimize, and control the way they run their business through those two applications. Let me start with three trends that are really shaping the way that we run our business today. First of all, there's digitalization. So obviously, every presentation that you get nowadays is about digitalization. It is a fact of life. I'm not going to talk about all of the benefits. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems and the risks of digitalization. But we are essentially trying to digitalize our business models and our operating models. And you can actually trace this back a couple of decades. So this is not necessarily something completely new, but we are seeing the impact, the effects of digitalization on the way that we run our business increasingly. The second thing is regulation. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. There is increasing regulatory pressure on how we do business. And this is impacting how we organize ourselves. And thirdly, resilience. We have been globalizing our business models over the last decades. Even if your, let's say, your sales market is strictly national, a lot of your supply chains are international. And that means that we're increasingly vulnerable to events on a global level. So I want to talk to you about how BPM and EAM as two main disciplines have been instrumental in helping organizations not only digitalize, improve their regulatory compliance and their operational resilience, but also how they are basically shaping the way of working even today. And also about the, let's say, the overlap and how they can strengthen each other. But let's talk about these three trends first. So first of all, digitalization. As far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of, it's a very overloaded word. There's essentially two types of digitalization. There's the digitalization of your business models, providing digital services and products to your customers. And secondly, there's the digitalization of the internal way of working in order to become more efficient. By not making that distinction, we sort of get very confusing discussions sometimes. That is what digitalization is about. The inward digitalization, as I call it, which is the automation of internal processes and systems, is something which is not really super new. This has been going on for 50 years. Outward digitalization, the advent of all kinds of digital products and services, is obviously a little bit more recent. Both of these trends have an immense impact on the processes and systems, both on a macro and micro level in our organizations. If we talk about the regulation, First of all, there's the flip side of digitalization. So it's correlated with digitalization. Ever since we started creating digital services and products, we've experienced that now owning all of that data coming from our customers is also a liability. We can actually be compromised. That data can be compromised, and it can lead to all kinds of unfortunate events and litigation, etc. So we need to become more and more protected. We need to get better and better at protecting ourselves against data risks in the digital arms race. Then the second trend within regulation is the fact that society, and in its wake, authorities, are increasingly wary of how we do our business and what our impact is on the environment, on the social fabric of our societies. And increasingly, that means that we are asked to provide evidence that we are safeguarding the social fabric of the countries that we operate in, that we are taking measures to not impact the environment in a negative way. What that means is that we need to have better and more efficient control systems. So the way that we tend to control the way of working in the organizations for decades or even for centuries is not necessarily good enough moving forward. The third trend that I mentioned is operational resilience. As I said, globalization has opened up a world of opportunity, but it has also opened up our organizations to vulnerabilities, which is something that we have obviously clearly seen with the pandemic, when parts of our supply chains just were cut off. But we also see it with all kinds of geopolitical events that impact where we can source our products, where we can source our labor, but also which markets we can actually sell our products into. So what that means is that with the greater opportunity to basically source labor and products from all over the world, we also need to make sure that we are properly insulated or agile enough to change the way of working, to adapt to changing international circumstances if and when necessary. So BPM and EAM are two disciplines. Business process management and enterprise architecture management are two practices, sets of practices that have been developing over the last more or less 30, 40 years. And they essentially both help to accelerate and de-risk transformation. So that was one of the purposes for BPM to evolve, and for EAM as well, and to simultaneously improve agility and control in the organization. Two things that are often seen as being at odds with each other. Business process management and enterprise architecture management have been evolving hand in hand, as it were, or simultaneously at least, over the last 40 years, 30, 40 years. I mean, you can argue that business process management started way back in the scientific management era with Taylor, so like 100 years ago. But for all practical purposes, what we can see is that BPM as a recognized discipline really started in the 1980s, with enterprise architecture management following more or less a decade later, so like in the 1990s. And if I go through that timeline of BPM and EAM, we see that there are a number of aspects where there's clear overlap. Whereas in the 1990s, or even before, BPM was really focused on total quality management, a lot of documentation of how we work, making sure that everyone is aware of the way of working, but it was largely a documentation exercise, even though analytical methods had already been were already being used at the time. At the same time, in what could be seen as a precursor to enterprise architecture management, we were doing information engineering. We were trying to understand how data was structured. So on the one hand, we had a discipline that was trying to understand how are we working, how are our processes structured. On the other hand, we had our data structure that we're trying to get ahead of. Why is this? It's because of digitalization. It's because of automation. It's because of the efficiency a wave that sort of started in the 1980s and 1990s as computers became prevalent in our offices. And then it started to accelerate in the 1990s of last century. Obviously, we saw the large ERP implementations coming at that time, like SAP, and the methodologies that came along with it in order to make those ERP implementations successful. So process redesign was one of the methodologies that we had in the 1990s. When I started in process management, like in the beginning of this century, I was starting it in a very negative atmosphere around BPM, because everyone remembered BPM from process redesign, from these massive bulldozer type of implementations of ERP systems. And process, as a result, got a very bad name from it. At the same time, in enterprise architecture, what we saw is that enterprise architects were sort of becoming a profession. Originally, these were software engineers, software architects working with UML, but gradually, architects started to consider the macro level of architecture. So how are all of these applications connected? What are the technologies that we're using? How are they integrated? They started doing that with UML originally. Frameworks were developed like TOGAF. And a lot of the discussion at that time was around how do we integrate ERP into our landscape? And how do we get rid of all the technologies? So where process design essentially was a way to shoehorn ERP into the organization, on the architect side, this sort of triggered the discussion about where do we use commercial off-the-shelf software and where do we use bespoke software. Now, in the noughties, let's say, and in the first decade of this century, we saw a lot of different digitalization initiatives. First of all, there was the workflow management and BPMS evolution, which on the architecture side was the service-oriented architecture wave. But then there were a couple of other developments as well. GRC became a thing. I think the word was coined in the early years of this century by Gartner. A broad collection of all kinds of different tools that would help us to make our control systems a little bit more efficient. And that had an impact on our processes. I remember my first project in this area was Sarbanes-Oxley, which was a massive inventory of all of the processes and then trying to figure out which controls fit where. This was one of the projects that actually led us to believe that we needed to have one process framework supporting all of our various different risk frameworks, rather than having every function essentially having their own view on how work was being executed across the organization. Another thing that we saw in the early years of this century is that we moved away from the old software engineering techniques to capture our architecture, and we moved to Archimate. So the first Archimate version came out in around about 2003, I can't remember exactly. I was actually involved in the first ARIS for Archimate product that we launched, I think in 2008. So architecture was becoming a more mature profession as well. And then in the previous decade, a lot of stuff started to happen. So first of all, we started to rethink how we build our processes in order to support those new digital products and services, and how to provide a better user experience. And that sort of started the customer journey mapping profession or practice. In the architecture space, we started to look at not just at applications and technologies, but we started to look at how can we create a sort of an abstraction layer that will make it easier to create the fit gap with the business side of things, and that's where capability management came from. That's what Peter Walraven will talk about a little bit in his presentation in an hour. What we also saw is professionalization on the ARIS side, particularly around digitalization. So BPMN came around, and process mining, something that had already been on the market for some time. Obviously, ARIS PPM was born also in the beginning of the century already, but process mining really took off at that time. And this was mirrored on the EAM side by a new era of low-code and no-code software development. In recent years, essentially what we have seen is BPM and EAM elevating to, again, a higher level of awareness across the organization, with BPM evolving into enterprise management systems. So no longer a set of tools and practices that you could use in individual projects, but rather more a capability that you can use across the organization, across functions, to define governance, to define ownership of end-to-end processes in the organization, and address transformation and optimization problems. In the enterprise architecture management space, we've seen something similar. Rather than being the area of a few architects in the organization, enterprise architecture management is now connected into many other IT disciplines, like strategic portfolio management, like agile and enterprise agile practices. And so in that sense, both disciplines have matured, and we can see a little bit of an overlap again in this age. In essence, if you look at what BPM and EAM are doing, BPM is a discipline that aims to continuously improve and adapt the way of working in the organization, while retaining full control of how you run your business. EAM, on the other hand, is particularly geared towards enabling fast transitions in the digital estate to accommodate new ways of working. So they both try to accelerate the adaptation that the organization has to do in order to change its operating model and ways of working to its changing business models. The overlap here is really business architecture. Both enterprise architecture management and business process management need a solid foundation of the process framework, the capability framework that defines how we do business and how do we operate across all of our various different functions. So on the BPM side, business architecture is really there to try and align all of the various different business and operating models, and to assign end-to-end responsibilities so that transformations and optimizations can be executed effectively. On the EAM side, business architecture helps to align IT architecture, the IT architecture operating model to the operating model, and connect IT and business responsibilities. So that's really the overlap between EAM and BPM. Together, they essentially both aim to provide more control over the IT estate and the way of working, and to provide more agility. By having a solid foundation and visibility of everything that of all of your processes and systems, you're able to adapt quicker when necessary. And obviously, what we provide from Software AG is products in these two areas. ARIS is our market-leading product for business process management, and Alphabet is our market-leading product for enterprise architecture management. And I'll talk a little bit about the relationship between EAM and IT portfolio management in a second. By the way, we are celebrating the 30th birthday of ARIS. What a lot of people don't know is that we are also celebrating the 25th birthday of Alphabet. As I said, Alphabet EAM started a little bit later than BPM in a sense, but both products really incorporate more than a quarter of a century of learning and supporting architects and process professionals from across the world in this software. I think that's why both ARIS and Alphabet are uniformly seen as the best products in their respective categories. If we look at that overlap that I was talking about, the around business architecture, essentially the way that we see our ARIS and Alphabet working together in our customers is that ARIS, as far as the business architecture is concerned, is the master of the process framework and the process responsibility. So the entire operating model of an organization and the way of working, which is closely related to it, is mastered in ARIS. In Alphabet, on the other hand, all of the rest of the enterprise architecture is maintained. That does not mean that everything is mastered in Alphabet. I think the key thing about Alphabet is that it provides a view across many different sources and different responsibilities. So the enterprise architecture could be partially mastered in Alphabet itself, for example, the application portfolio, but a lot of the other portfolios could be sourced partially or completely from third party, from third tools, as it were. And Alphabet then connects all of these portfolios together in order to provide an excellent planning capability. And this is then partially replicated back into ARIS. So in ARIS, obviously, if we're setting up our process framework, what we would like to understand is which applications do we use in which processes. And so often even into a micro level where we want to know exactly which service we are using in a particular task in a process. The process design, things like job instructions and all of that detail is really design. It's not architecture anymore. So I'm leaving it out of the scope here. So one of the, I would say, discussions that we've had over the many years is, so how do we position ARIS and Alphabet? Is ARIS for modeling and is Alphabet for planning? Not necessarily. I would say ARIS is for BPM and Alphabet is for EAM. And there is an overlap. That overlap is not easy to basically segregate into an ARIS part and an Alphabet part. Many of our customers are using Archimate. Archimate encompasses the entire enterprise architecture, including your process framework. So you can actually model out your complete process architecture in Archimate. You could say, we will do all of our enterprise architecture in ARIS. The problem is that if you go to a slightly more micro level in your architecture, then modeling is really not the best way of capturing your architecture. If you count only your major technologies, you could probably model it out. If you model all of your technology versions in order to be able to plan, technology upgrades and that sort of stuff, then modeling is really not the best solution. So this is one of the aspects that we have been thinking about over the last couple of years. I know that a lot of customers are really happy with using Archimate in ARIS. But on the other hand, we have customers that are really happy with the planning capabilities in Alphabet, but would like to be able to do some enterprise architecture modeling or visualization without having to switch tools all the time or building complicated integrations to replicate architectures from ARIS into Alphabet or vice versa. So one of the things that we are currently working on is bringing Archimate into Alphabet this year. We have a working version right now. As you may or may not know, there is a modeling capability in Alphabet, which did not previously support Archimate. We are working on that now. What I would like to ask you is, for those customers that, for those of you who are already working with Archimate and are working with Alphabet as well, or are planning to look into Alphabet, I would like to get your feedback on how you use Archimate today, how you would like to use Archimate in the future, and what pointers you can give us as we integrate Archimate, as we implement Archimate into Alphabet. So if you have any thoughts about this, if you have any ideas about this, please reach out to me or to one of the Alphabet colleagues that are here in the audience. we would love to hear about you, and we would love to see what you will do with our Archimate capability inside of Alphabet. With that, I have come to the end of my presentation, right on time. I still have 5 minutes, I think, for questions and feedback. If you violently disagree with anything that I said, I would like to hear it. If you do agree with it, I would like to hear it. So obviously, excluding you. Thank you. Worries?
Test? Okay. Thank you, Eric, for the presentation. Are there any questions in the room?
Thanks, Eric, for the presentation. I already had last 2 days a couple of discussions with people from ARIS as well as from Alphabet. I'm slightly surprised. Let me explain. On the one hand, I see BPM and EAM being separated as two different worlds. BPM is part of EAM, right? In my view. You're doing process modeling management. I mean, this is one of the things that I actually see coming back year after year on the International ARIS User Group Conference. And that is, ARIS is about BPM. Now, it's not. It's about actually managing your knowledge, processes, information, highly underestimated and underrated, and your IT. Enterprise architecture is not about IT, just IT. It's also about that. I completely agree with you when you're saying that the part about getting an inventory of your versions, etc., which is even license management, that goes way beyond the AI and EA. Of course, you're not going to manage that. The point is that you're managing your portfolio. That's what you do in Alphabet and tools like that. Managing and planning your enterprise, not enterprise-wide IT, but your enterprise is about risks, processes, IT, data, roles, etc. That's what you have ARIS for. So I think the balance is not about finding the gap where they overlap. It's not really about what is EAM and what is BPM, because I think that's a sort of a red herring. It's about what is portfolio management, that's what the power of Alphabet is, versus what is enterprise architecture management. Your reaction, please.
If you look at BPM, there are a lot of different practices in there, a lot of different tools that are being used, and they've been used for a long time. A lot of people would associate BPM with Lean Six Sigma. A lot of people would associate BPM to an extent with quality management. Those are functions in an organization that are organized completely separate from architecture. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, it is what it is. So BPM is actually a wide selection of tools and practices that we have to understand how we work in an organization and how we can manage work and how we can optimize work. A lot of that work has been automated. Whether or not we want to see enterprise architecture as more than just IT, the birthright of enterprise architecture is IT. If we didn't have the wave of automation and information technology starting from the, let's say, 70s, 80s, enterprise architecture would not exist. So enterprise architecture really focuses on how do we manage the automation part of enterprise architecture. In practice, enterprise architects in 9 out of 10 cases report into the CIO, which tells us something, whereas BPM reports into all kinds of different functions. And it's the fact that they are two, or actually not two, there are probably a lot of different groups, some of which are more closely associated with BPM, some of which are more closely related with EAM. In practice, what we see is that we actually sell Alphabet into a different group of buyers in the organization than ARIS. The ownership structure is different for Alphabet and for ARIS. And I completely agree that there is a Venn diagram with an overlap. And what I've been trying to do today in my presentation is to sort of pinpoint that overlap. Without going into, I I'm not saying that enterprise architecture should not be in ARIS. I'm not saying that processes should not be in Alphabet. What I'm saying is that Alphabet, we are developing to be the best IT portfolio management product in the world. ARIS, we're developing to be the best business process management platform in the world. And enterprise architecture is a little bit across both. And that...
Not what you said on your slide, it's BPM, EAM. And they're
Yeah.
really try to...
I was trying to juxtapose them, indeed. Maybe I should have included the Venn diagram as well, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I suggest if there are any other questions in the room. Okay, one last question, but for time reasons, we should go to the next presenter then.
I try to make it short. You were saying, or I understood, that you will add capabilities to depict Archimate diagrams in Alphabet.
Yes.
So I was wondering whether you're also working on a seamless integration between ARIS and Alphabet for that, because ARIS obviously also offers Archimate diagrams, and if there would be no interface, then it would still require redundancy of work.
Exactly. That's definitely something that we're considering right now. We really need to get more input in terms of how we are using Archimate today in all of the various different organizations that are represented here to sort of shape how we will create that integration. We have the basic capabilities to integrate, so we can essentially replicate everything from Alphabet to ARIS and vice versa, everything within the Archimate universe at least. How we want to do that, that is really something that we want to discuss with you guys in the next couple of months to shape the first version, the MVP, that we'll bring out in 2022.